Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fifth webinar in our Small Flock Poultry Fundamentals for Veterinary and Extension Professionals series. This series is designed to provide practical, research-based information for professionals who work with small flock poultry owners. Today's session, Biosecurity for Small Poultry Flocks, will focus on understanding how pathogens can move between animal populations, recognizing and investigating potential biosecurity pathways, and helping producers identify practical ways to reduce risk. Before we get started, just a quick housekeeping note. We'll have a few opportunities for discussion and participation during the presentation, so I'll invite you to share your thoughts or work through scenarios with us at those points. For questions that aren't part of those planned discussions, please hold those until the end of the presentation. You are welcome to put them in the chat as they come up so you don't forget them, and we'll make time at the end to answer as many as possible. Whether you're joining us live or watching the recording later, thank you for being here. Let's get started. So today we're here to talk about biosecurity for small poultry flocks. As with the other sessions in the series, we're approaching this from the perspective of the people who support small flock owners, veterinarians, extension educators, and others who help producers troubleshoot problems and make management decisions. So rather than giving you a list of biosecurity rules, we're going to focus on a way of thinking about biosecurity, how pathogens could move, how we can investigate those pathways, and how we can help identify practical ways to reduce risk. This webinar series was developed with the support from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture through the North Central Region Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, or SARE program. The full funding acknowledgement and required USDA statement are included on the slide for your reference. We're grateful for the support, which has allowed us to develop resources for veterinary and extension professionals working with small flock poultry owners. Before we move into today's topic, I'd like to review a few important disclaimers. First, Lincoln University is an equal opportunity employer and provider. The full non-discrimination statement is included on this slide for reference. Throughout the presentation, you may see references to specific products, equipment, or brand names. These examples are provided solely for educational purposes and should not be interpreted as endorsements by Lincoln University or our project partners. Finally, the information presented today is intended for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for veterinary medical advice. Individual flock health concerns should always be evaluated within an established veterinarian client-patient relationship. I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself for anybody who has not been in our previous sessions. For those of you who have been here, welcome back. If you are here for your first time, we're glad to have you with us. My name is Tatiana Fisher. I'm an assistant professor and the State Poultry Extension Specialist at Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri. My extension and research programs focus on small flock poultry production, including flock health, management, biosecurity, and producer education. So today's topic is closely connected to the work I do, and I'm looking forward to working through some practical examples with you and thinking about how we can apply these ideas in our own work with small flock owners. Rather than starting with a list of biosecurity practices, we're going to start with a question. How could a pathogen move through this situation? That question is going to guide us through today's session. We'll use it to investigate pathways, identify opportunities to interrupt them, and think about what realistic risk reduction can look like for both producers and professionals. By the end of the session, you'll be able to define biosecurity and explain its purpose, identify potential pathogen transmission pathways, apply risk-based biosecurity principles, investigate biosecurity risks in small flocks, and recommend practical interventions. We'll build toward those objectives by first learning how to recognize potential pathways, then practicing how to investigate them, and finally applying that process to our own work and to conversations with producers. So how are we going to approach these objectives? I want to start with an idea that will shape how we think about biosecurity today. When we hear biosecurity, it's easy to think about a list of practices. Clean this, separate that, don't share equipment. Those practices matter, but for those of us who are supporting producers, an even more useful skill is being able to figure out what matters in a particular situation. That's where our biosecurity investigator muscles come in. Observe, ask, connect, prioritize, act. We'll use these 5 habits throughout today's discussion as we work through situations that may look pretty familiar. We'll look to see what's happening, understand the pathway, decide what matters, and then do something useful. Before we start using those investigator muscles, let's make sure we're talking about the same thing when we say biosecurity. I'm going to use the USDA APHIS definition from the Defend the Flock program. They define biosecurity as referring to everything people do to keep diseases and the viruses, bacteria, funguses, parasites, and other microorganisms that cause disease away from birds, property, and people. The part I want to emphasize is everything people do. It's easy to think of biosecurity as a list of practices, cleaning and disinfection, changing footwear, separating new birds. Those things matter, but biosecurity is broader than any one practice. It means thinking about how people, animals, equipment, materials, and places are connected, and what we can do to manage those connections. With that definition in mind, let's look at 2 broad ways we can put biosecurity into practice: structural biosecurity and operational biosecurity. So we'll start with structural biosecurity. Structural biosecurity is about the physical environment we're working with, the way facilities, equipment, and spaces are set up and maintained to help manage disease risk. There are a few different ways we can think about that. First is physical separation. For example, this fencing creates a physical boundary around the birds. Barriers, controlled access, and the way spaces are arranged can all influence who or what gets into an area and how easily things move between areas. Then we have wildlife and pest exclusion. A snake getting into a poultry area is a pretty obvious example of why the physical environment matters. We're not only thinking about people moving between flocks, we're also thinking about what other animals can access the birds, their feed, their water, and their housing. And finally, structural biosecurity can include facilities that support isolation. Here, the chicks are being kept separate from the adult birds. Having a space that allows us to separate groups can give us an opportunity to manage risk before those birds are introduced into the larger flock. The important thing is that the physical environment can either make good biosecurity easier or make it harder. And with small flocks, we may not always have an ideal setup. We may be working with mobile housing, existing buildings that we have to retrofit, or temporary spaces. Almost always, we're dealing with facilities that weren't designed with biosecurity in mind. That doesn't mean we stop thinking about biosecurity. It means we look at what physical setups allow us to do and where we may need other practices to help fill the gaps. And that's where operational biosecurity comes in, what people actually do within that environment. Operational biosecurity is the practices, procedures, and policies that people follow consistently. And this is where we probably recognize many of the things we normally think of when we hear the word biosecurity. We can think about how people, animals, and materials move. For example, these transport crates are moving birds from one location to another. What happens before those crates are used again? We can think about how housing and animal areas are managed between groups of birds. For example, removing litter between flocks is an operational practice that can help reduce the buildup or carryover of potential pathogens. And we can think about what happens when people enter an animal area, such as using boot covers during a farm tour. There are also operational practices around new animals, visitors, equipment, and responding when we see signs of a health problem starting. But there's an important word on this slide: consistently. Having a boot bath on the property isn't by itself operational biosecurity. Having a written visitor procedure isn't by itself operational biosecurity. The question is whether the practices actually happen and whether they happen in a way that makes sense for the people and animals involved. So when we're looking at a flock, rather than asking, is this flock biosecure, a more useful set of questions is, what does the structure allow us to do? What are people actually doing? And what are the gaps that matter? To answer those questions, we need to understand how pathogens could move through the system, and that's where we're going to start applying those investigator muscles. So we've defined biosecurity and looked at the physical environment and the practices people use to manage risk. But to investigate biosecurity, we have to go one step further. We need to understand how pathogens could actually move through a system. So let's look at the bigger picture. How do pathogens move? Take a look at the network on this slide. We have 2 farms, an office or clinic, and a store. And we have people, birds, or other animals, equipment, vehicles, and other materials moving between these locations. Notice that the arrows go both directions. Movement isn't simply a matter of something going from a farm out into the world. A person can go from farm 1 to the clinic and then to farm 2. A producer could go from their farm to the store and then straight back home. Equipment can move from one farm to another and back. Animals can move between locations, and sometimes that leaves one animal population passing through several locations before reaching another population. So I don't want us to think of a farm as an isolated bubble. Animal populations are connected to a network of people, places, animals, equipment, vehicles, and materials. Those connections create potential pathways for pathogens to move. And that's an important distinction. Just because something moves between locations doesn't mean pathogen transmission occurred. Our job is to figure out which pathways are meaningful, where there may have been an opportunity for exposure, and where we might be able to interrupt that pathway. So as you look at this network, start asking yourself, what is moving? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? And what animal populations could potentially be connected by that movement? Those are the questions we're going to practice next. Let's apply this to a real-world situation. We have a producer calling with a problem. The owner of a small flock went out of town for several days, and a neighbor cared for the flock. When the owner returned, several birds were sick. Where would you start? Think about that for a second. What would you want to know? Think about that and drop your thoughts in the chat. Now, let's hold on to those thoughts for a minute. At this point, we don't know what caused the problem. We don't even know whether the neighbor has anything to do with it. So rather than jumping to a conclusion, we're going to investigate. We'll add information a little at a time and see whether and how that changes the questions we're asking. The important thing is that we're going to let the information lead us rather than deciding on the explanation first. So let's step back from the question of what caused the problem and think about what information would help us investigate it. Take a few seconds and think about the questions you want answered. I'd start by looking at a few broad areas. People, who had contact with the flock, who came onto the property, where had they been before they arrived? Animals, what animals are involved? Were any animals introduced, removed, moved between groups, or otherwise in contact with the flock? Equipment and materials, what moved onto or off of the property? Was anything shared with another flock or another animal population? Movement. Where had people, animals, equipment, or other materials been before they reached the flock? And where did they go after? And then timing. When did these things happen? When was the flock exposed to a particular person, animal, place, or object? And when did this illness first become apparent? We don't need to ask every possible question every time. The point is to build up enough of a picture to identify potential pathways worth investigating. And now we'll add a little bit more information to our case. First, we learned that the neighbor doesn't own poultry. Does that change anything? Maybe. Then we learn that they do have dogs and cats. Then we learn something more interesting. The neighbor also helps care for their parents' poultry flock. So now we have a connection between 2 poultry populations. Then we learn that the neighbor visits their parents' flock before coming to this flock. Now we have a direction of potential movement. Finally, we learned that the neighbor has a pair of favorite boots that they wear everywhere, including both to their parents' house and the subject flock's house. So notice what happened. We can now describe a potential pathway. The parents' flock through the neighbor on their boots to the subject flock. Now, we didn't start by deciding that the neighbor caused the problem, and for all we know, the neighbor still is not actually responsible. But we started with a situation, asked the question, and added some information. As that information accumulated, we were able to describe the potential pathway more specifically, and that's the skill that we are practicing. Don't jump to the conclusion. Build the pathway from the information you have. So what made this pathway more interesting as we learned more? It wasn't simply that the neighbor had contact with another flock. It was the combination of several pieces of information. We have another poultry population, we have movement between the two populations, and we know the direction of that movement. We have something, the boots, that could potentially move with the person, and we have a timeline that we can consider alongside when the problem occurred. Taken together, those details give us a plausible pathway worth investigating. Now that we've identified a potential pathway worth investigating, let's shift from investigation to risk reduction. We know that something could potentially move from one flock to another through the neighbor and their footwear. So where could we interrupt that pathway? We could change the order of visits so that the lower risk flock is visited before the higher risk flock. We could change the footwear between locations. We could clean and disinfect footwear before entering the flock, or use dedicated footwear or another protective barrier. And we could also be thinking about hand hygiene and cleaning or disinfecting any equipment that might be needed at both flocks. So notice that there isn't necessarily one single intervention point. There may be several opportunities to reduce the risk along the same pathway. We don't have to identify one perfect solution yet. Instead, we look at the pathway and ask, where do we have the opportunity to interrupt it? And usually there's more than one place. Then we can think about which of these options will make the most sense for a given situation. The practical question is, what would actually work here? Again, the goal is to reduce meaningful risk. In an ideal situation, we might have separate people caring for each flock. That would completely remove this particular pathway, but that might not be realistic. So we might look at other options. Separate boots, boot covers, clean and disinfect the boots between flocks. Each of these could reduce the opportunity for something to be carried on footwear to move from one flock to another. And there may be other options as well. We're looking for a scientifically sound, realistic way to reduce meaningful risk. And that's especially important with small flocks. Our recommendations need to be something the producer can actually carry out consistently. That's part of our job as professionals, translating a potential pathway into an intervention that makes sense for the situation we're actually looking at. So far, we've focused on identifying a potential pathway and finding opportunities to interrupt it. But identifying a good intervention is only part of the job. We also need to communicate the recommendation clearly enough that the producer understands what we're asking them to do and why it matters. We want to tell the producer when the recommendation applies, what they should actually do, and why we're recommending it. So rather than saying, improve biosecurity, we might say, when someone has visited another poultry flock, what? Change footwear before entering your poultry area. Why? We're trying to reduce the chance that something carried on footwear moves from one flock to another. That explanation connects the recommendation back to the pathway we just investigated. It also gives the producer some context for the recommendation. We're not simply saying, do this because it's a biosecurity rule. We're explaining what risk we're trying to reduce. And that distinction can make recommendations much more useful. When we're specific about when, what, and why, the producer has a clearer understanding of what we're asking them to do, when they need to do it, and how that action fits into the larger biosecurity picture. So we've used a specific example about how a producer can identify and reduce a biosecurity risk. But let's turn the lens back towards ourselves, because we're not just advising people who move between animal populations. We may be moving between animal populations too. If we're visiting multiple farms or flocks in the course of our work, we're part of that same network we were just talking about. And there's one other option we shouldn't overlook. Sometimes the best way to manage a pathway is not to create it in the first place. If a question can be answered by phone, email, or another remote interaction, we may be able to provide useful support without physically moving from one animal population to another. Of course, sometimes an in-person visit really is necessary. We may need to see the animals, observe the facilities, troubleshoot a problem, or work directly with the producer. So when we need to be there, the question becomes, what moves with us? Let's follow a typical professional workday and see where those pathways might appear. At 8 a.m., you visit Farm 1, and that visit may have nothing to do with poultry. You could be there for cattle, another farm-related issue, or simply to pick something up. But if poultry are on the property, they're still part of the biosecurity picture. You return to the office or clinic. And then in the afternoon, you visit Farm 2. And again, your poultry may not be the reason why you're there, but there are birds on that farm too. Nothing about that schedule sounds particularly unusual. You're doing your job. But let's look at that day through the lens we've been using. You've now moved between two farms and potentially between multiple animal populations. So rather than asking, did I do something wrong? Let's ask, what moved with me? And what did those things come into contact with? For the moment, don't worry about whether something represents a high or low risk. Let's just follow the movement. What did you contact at Farm 1? What did you take with you when you left? What happened between Farm 1 and Farm 2? And what eventually entered Farm 2? Let's walk through the day and see what we might identify. So what came with you? Take a few seconds and think about things beyond the obvious. What are some things you might carry from one farm to another, even when poultry wasn't the reason for your visit? And feel free to leave your thoughts in the chat or comments. So there are some obvious answers: clothing, footwear, vehicle, equipment, sometimes samples or other materials. And some things are easy to overlook. We might think carefully about our boots, for example, but not think about a clipboard, phone, camera, sampling kit, stethoscope, or even the handles of our vehicle. But we're not assuming that everything on this list represents a significant risk. We're just following the pathway. So we can ask now, what did you contact at Farm 1? What had an opportunity for exposure? What did you take with you? And what eventually entered or had contact with the animal areas at Farm 2? Some things may turn out not to matter. Some may deserve more attention. The point isn't to create a checklist of 20 things you should never do. It's to develop the habit of looking at your own workday and recognizing where the meaningful pathways are. Once we can identify those pathways, we can make much more targeted decisions about what we actually need to change. So we've moved through the workday and identified some potential pathways, but now let's ask, where are the high-value opportunities to interrupt these potential pathways? We could intervene at several of those points. Before the visit, we might change the order of our visits or decide whether an in-person visit is necessary. During the visit, we might manage what we touch, where we go, or what we bring into an animal area. Between visits, we might change clothing or footwear, clean and disinfect our equipment, or otherwise manage things that could carry material from one location to another. And then after the visit, we can think about what leaves the property with us and what happens to it before we enter another animal environment. Notice that we're not saying that we need to do all these things every time. We're identifying points where the pathway could be interrupted. And that gives us options. The next question is, what happens when we add the realities of our work? So far, we've been looking at the pathway somewhat like a map. But our actual work happens on a schedule, and sometimes that schedule doesn't go exactly as planned. Let's add a little real life to our workday. Remember our first farm visit? We originally planned to leave farm number 1 and return to the office by 10:30, but the visit runs long. Now we don't leave farm 1 until 11. We get back at noon. Our next farm visit is scheduled for 1. So now we have an hour to get back to the office and needing to get to the next farm. What does that change? Maybe under our original schedule, we had plenty of time to go home or change clothes. Maybe we had plenty of time to clean and disinfect our boots and equipment between visits. But now we've lost some of that time. We have a decision to make. Do we have time to complete the same interventions as we originally planned? Are there some things we can still do? And are there other things we need to think about before we have actually left farm number 1? Because we may not have much time once we got back to the office. This is where biosecurity becomes a real world problem rather than just a theoretical one. The pathway hasn't changed, but the circumstances have. And that may change which interventions are practical. And that's why we need to think about biosecurity not just in terms of what could reduce risk, but also what can be realistically accomplished with the way we're actually working. So let's make the situation a little more challenging. We know our next farm visit starts at 1, but we don't leave the farm number 1 until 12:50. Luckily, farm number 2 is only about 10 minutes away, but there's no time to go back to the office. So what do? In some situations, the simplest answer might be to reschedule the second visit, but let's assume this is an example of an urgent or emergency call, and we have to be at farm number 2 as scheduled. So now we have to think on our feet. We need to quickly assess the situation. What moved with us from farm number 1? What are we about to take into farm number 2? And what can we do right now to reduce the risk? We may not be able to carry out our ideal plan, but we can still make decisions about what matters most. Maybe there's an intervention we can take immediately. Maybe there's something we can leave behind rather than bringing it onto farm number 2. Or maybe we need to modify how we approach the visit once we arrive. The specific decision depends on the circumstances. The important thing is that we're recognizing the pathway and making a deliberate decision rather than simply continuing with our original plan. And we won't always have perfect circumstances. We need to be able to adapt. But ideally, we're not figuring all of this out for the first time, 10 minutes before it matters. Biosecurity is part of the job. If we regularly move between farms or animal populations, we can build some of this thinking into our normal work rather than treating it as something we address only when problems arise. That starts with pre-planning. Before we leave for the day, we can think about where we're going, which animal populations we'll encounter, and how those visits fit together. We can make sure we have the supplies and equipment we need before we get there. And we can think about the situations that could make our original plan difficult to follow. We can't predict what will happen during every workday, but planning ahead gives us more options when something does change. So the goal isn't to create a plan that can never be disrupted. It's to make biosecurity part of how we plan and do our work so that when we have to think on our feet, we're better prepared to make a good decision. So we've looked at our own role in pathogen movement. Let's turn our attention back to the people that we support. We've been using the same questions to understand our movement. Now we'll use that way of thinking to help producers identify and reduce risk in their operations. Our job isn't simply to hand a producer a list of biosecurity recommendations. Our job is to help producers understand the risks in their own operation and work with them to find realistic ways to reduce those risks. Improve your biosecurity isn't particularly actionable, and even a recommendation like don't let visitors into the poultry area might be reasonable advice, but it may not address the most important risk on that particular farm. Instead, we want to engage the producer in the process. What is happening on the farm? What connects this flock to other animal populations? Where are the meaningful opportunities to reduce risk, and what changes are realistic for this producer? That gives us our basic approach. Start with the pathway, identify how something could move. Find the opportunity for where the pathway could be interrupted or the risk reduced. And then work with the producer to determine practical actions. Figure out what makes sense and what they can realistically carry out. The goal isn't for us to dictate a list of rules from above. It's to help the producer understand why a particular risk matters and participate in deciding how to address it. That makes the recommendation more relevant to their operation and gives them a better chance of actually using it. Before we recommend anything, let's start with the pathway. A useful thing to think about is what connects this flock to other animal populations. That might be another flock. It might be people who visit. It might be equipment or other materials. It might be animals moving onto or off the property. It might be a show, sale, fair, or other event. Or it might be something as ordinary as a vehicle, a feed delivery, or a family member who works somewhere else with animals. And notice that we're not asking, what biosecurity rules are you following? We're asking about what actually happens. That's important because people don't necessarily describe their routines in terms of biosecurity. A producer may not say, we have a visitor biosecurity issue. They may say, my neighbor helps with chores, or my daughter shows chickens, or I love my truck. It's great for hauling feed and birds, and last week I put a whole pig in it. Those ordinary descriptions are where we can start finding the pathways. And once we've identified a pathway, we can ask a different question. Where are the opportunities to interrupt it? There may be several opportunities along the same potential pathway. We might change what people do. We might change how equipment or other materials are handled. We might separate animals. We might change the order of movement. We might clean or disinfect something before it moves, or we might eliminate a particular movement altogether. The important thing is that we don't have to identify one single intervention right away. In fact, I would encourage you to look for several possible opportunities before making any suggestions to change. If one isn't practical, another might be. And sometimes several smaller changes can work together without requiring a major change to the operation. This is also where structural and operational biosecurity can come back into the conversation. Sometimes the opportunity is a change to the physical setup, a barrier, a separation, or a facility that makes a safer practice easier. Sometimes it's a change in what people do, and sometimes it's both. At this stage, we're not deciding what the producer should do. We're identifying where the pathway could be interrupted and what options might be available. Then we can work with the producer to decide what makes sense. So we've identified a pathway and we've identified several places where we could interrupt it. Now we have to help the producer decide what to do. And this is where working with small flocks gets interesting. We're balancing two things. How much risk reduction could this option provide, and how feasible is it for this flock to actually do it? We don't want to choose an intervention simply because it's easy, but we also don't want to recommend something that sounds excellent on paper and won't be followed consistently. Let's go back to our neighbor example. Having a different person care for each flock might provide the greatest risk reduction because it removes that particular pathway. But if that option isn't realistic, there are other options. Changing footwear, cleaning and disinfecting the footwear, using boot covers, changing the order of visits, or even combining multiple measures. At this point, our role as advisors is not to choose the perfect answer for the producer. It's to help them understand the risk and consider the options and think through what'll actually work in their operation. So we connect the recommendation to the pathway, and we help the producer weigh the potential risk reduction against what's realistic for their situation. And then we support them in choosing an approach that they can actually sustain. We're helping the producer make a good decision, not simply giving them an answer. Let's put this approach together with one more example. Imagine a producer who regularly takes birds to poultry shows. The birds return to the home flock after the event, and some of the equipment used at the show is also used at home. Rather than immediately telling this producer what they should change, let's work through the situation with them. First, think about the pathway. What connects this flock to other animal populations? Here we have animals moving between the show and the home flock, along with potentially people, equipment, and other materials. Next, think about the opportunity. Where could we interrupt those pathways? We might look at what happens before birds return to the flock, how equipment is handled, and where we could separate, clean, or otherwise manage those movements. And then think about potential actions. What could this producer realistically change? That will obviously depend on their operation and their resources and what actually happens at their events and at their farm. But what might that look like? One possible approach would be to keep show equipment separate from equipment used with the home flock and clean and disinfect equipment before it comes back into the flock. They also might want to look at how the birds are handled when they return and whether there are opportunities to separate them and maybe keep them in a quarantine from away from the home flock while they're addressing those risks. The exact recommendation would depend on circumstances and resources, but the important thing is that we've connected the action to the pathway that we've identified. We started with a general concern, birds going to shows, and worked our way towards specific practical changes that producer could consider. And that's the process. Pathway, opportunity, action. That process helps us move from a general concern about biosecurity to a specific conversation about what this producer can actually do. So what does good biosecurity advice actually look like? It's not necessarily the longest list of recommendations. It's advice that's specific to the pathway we're trying to address. It focuses on meaningful risk rather than trying to eliminate every possible source of exposure. It offers practical options that make sense for the situation. And ultimately, it leads to something the producer can sustain. That's where our role as professionals matter. We bring the knowledge and experience to help identify the risk and possible ways to reduce it. But we're not simply handing the producer an answer. We're helping them understand the pathway and consider their options before they ultimately decide what will work for them. So good advice isn't just about knowing what should be done. It's about helping the producer understand their options and identify an approach that's practical and sustainable for their operation. So I want to come back to where we started. Throughout the session, we've been practicing a way of thinking about biosecurity, not just a list of practices to memorize. Remember our framework of observe, ask, connect, prioritize, act. We've used those habits to look at a flock problem. We've looked at how we as professionals can become part of a pathway when we move between animal populations, and we've used the same approach to help producers understand and reduce risk. So when you go back to your own work, I don't want you to feel like you need to memorize one more checklist. Instead, when you encounter a flock or a biosecurity question, start with what's actually happening. Think about what's moving, what's it contacting, what connects this flock to other animal populations, and then ask, where is the meaningful opportunity to interrupt this pathway? And finally, what can realistically be done? Those are the investigator muscles that we need to work on. The more we practice using them, the better we become at recognizing meaningful pathways, focusing our attention where it matters, and helping producers make changes that they can actually sustain. And that's the skill I hope you take from today's session. And if you remember just a few things from today, I come back to these three. First, look for the pathway. Understand what connects animal populations and what could potentially move between them. Second, find the opportunity. Don't assume every connection needs the same intervention. Look for the places where we have a meaningful opportunity to interrupt that pathway. And third, support action. Our role isn't simply to tell producers what they should do. It's to help them understand the risk, weigh the options, and choose changes that they can actually sustain. That's the framework I hope you can take to your next biosecurity conversation. Which brings us to the end of our session, and I want to thank you for spending your time with us today. I hope you leave with a little more confidence in looking at biosecurity, not just as a list of practices, but as a way of thinking about pathogen movement, risk, and what we can do about it. I've included a few resources here that you can use with producers after this session. The USDA Defend the Flock program is a good starting point for practical poultry biosecurity information and educational materials. The CDC's backyard poultry resources are also useful, particularly when you're talking with producers and about the connection between poultry health and human health. The Poultry Extension and University of Maryland Extension resources provide additional small flock focused guidance. And you don't necessarily need to give a producer all of these resources. Think about which one fits the conversations you're having and the pathway or risk you're trying to address. The goal is to use these resources to support the conversation, not to replace it. As we wrap up today's session, I'd like to take a moment to highlight what's coming up next in the series. We're now over halfway through our Small Flock Poultry Fundamentals for Veterinary and Extension Professionals webinar series. If you missed any of the earlier sessions, don't worry. Recordings are available on our YouTube channel in a playlist titled Small Flock Poultry Fundamentals for Veterinary and Extension Professionals, so you can catch up anytime. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday, August 18th at 12 p.m. Central Time, and we'll be discussing egg safety, food safety, and public health. We look forward to sharing that session with you. Thank you again for your time and interest in the Small Flock Poultry Fundamentals series. Whether you've joined us live today or you're watching this recording, we appreciate your participation and your commitment to supporting small flock poultry owners through education and outreach. And we hope you found today's session valuable. We look forward to seeing you at future webinars. And if you'd like to stay connected with our program, you can use this contact information to reach out with any questions. And you can always follow us on social media for additional resources, updates, and upcoming educational opportunities. And with that, we've reached the end of today's formal presentation. Thank you again for spending your time with us and for the work you do to support poultry owners and your communities. If you need to hop off at this point, thanks for joining us. We'll see you at the next session. For those who are able to stay, we'll stick around for questions and discussion. And if you're watching this recording and haven't registered for the remainder of the series, we'd love to have you join us live. Registration is completely free. Simply scan the QR code on the screen or visit the registration link to sign up. Once you're registered, you'll automatically receive the Zoom link for all the remaining sessions. Even if your schedule doesn't allow you to attend live every time, we still encourage you to register. Your registration helps us demonstrate demand for these educational programs, and that support is important as we plan future webinars and educational opportunities. The more interest we can demonstrate, the better positioned we are to continue offering series like this in the future. So we hope you'll register and join us for one or more of remaining sessions.